Now, today we're doing copper.
Copper, what would that tariff be on? The sectional tariff?
I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%.
50%.
President Trump also slapped 50% tariffs on copper imports, but he exempted refined metals. You can see the huge plunge that had.
Less than a day after a new trade policy took effect, the United States suddenly found itself cut off from over $4.2 billion worth of critical resources. Copper prices in American markets skyrocketed, jumping about 13% overnight and hitting nearly $6 per pound, a record high. That sharp spike on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange sent shockwaves through U.S. industries. From electronics manufacturers to home builders, it felt like the economic floor had dropped out from beneath them. And that was just the beginning. American businesses and consumers were about to experience a cascade of consequences, all sparked by one bold decision at the very top. So, what triggered this sudden economic shock? It all started with a single announcement from President Donald Trump. In early July, Trump unveiled a sweeping new tariff, a 50% duty on all imported copper. He invoked a rarely used trade rule, citing national security concerns. First announced during a cabinet meeting in Washington, and later amplified on social media, the move rattled global commodity markets almost instantly. Trump argued that copper is vital to America's defense and tech infrastructure. From ammunition and aircraft to semiconductors and power grids, copper is everywhere. He framed the tariff as a patriotic effort to revive domestic copper production and reduce dependence on foreign suppliers. The new tariff was set to take effect on August 1st, 2025. Giving companies just a few weeks to brace for massive changes. Trump pointed to his previous trade policies on steel, aluminum, lumber, and automobiles as proof that this was part of a broader strategy. But this time, the target wasn't just another industrial material. Copper is the invisible backbone of modern life. The immediate aftermath was something even the administration couldn't ignore. Prices surged. Trade partners grew hostile. And uncertainty spread like wildfire across boardrooms across the US. But what happened next was even more surprising. One of America's closest allies struck back, turning the entire situation upside down. We'll get to that in a moment. First, the announcement triggered chaos in the global copper market. In the US, copper futures soared overnight as buyers rushed to lock in supplies before the tariff kicked in. By the following day, U.S. copper was trading at unprecedented prices, around $5.65 to $5.69 per pound, levels never before seen in American markets. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, copper prices on the London Metal Exchange dipped slightly. Why? Because traders feared that the U.S. would drastically cut back on imported copper. This led to a rare price divergence. American copper suddenly cost up to 25% more than the international rate. Such a gap is virtually unheard of in today's interconnected global economy, where arbitrage opportunities are typically short-lived. But this time, it was different. Enterprising traders and metal suppliers saw a chance to profit. They scrambled to exploit the price gap, finding ways to move cheaper copper into the US, tariff or not. Some looked for loopholes, like routing copper through countries not subject to the duty or disguising refined copper as scrap or alloy. Shipping containers were booked at a furious pace. Supply contracts were hastily rewritten. The market turned into a free-for-all. Critics quickly pointed out what they saw as a major flaw in the policy. Instead of helping the US copper industry, the tariff unleashed chaos. Costs rose, and businesses prepared to pass those increases on to consumers. Meanwhile, foreign copper might still sneak in through back channels, undermining the goal of boosting American production. In trying to isolate the US copper market, the policy instead destabilized it. But perhaps the most dramatic reaction came from an unexpected place: Canada. The US relies heavily on Canadian copper. Nearly half of America's refined copper imports typically come from its northern neighbor. When Trump's tariff was announced, Canada suddenly found itself holding a powerful bargaining chip, and they didn't hesitate to use it. Within days, Canadian officials responded by halting all copper export contracts to the US major mining companies like Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals quickly suspended shipments to American buyers. Warehouse orders were cancelled or rerouted elsewhere. It was a bold move, but Canadian leaders felt they had little choice. They saw the tariff as an abrupt, unilateral decision that violated the spirit of partnership. As one insider put it, "We can't rely on a trading partner that changes the rules overnight without warning." The impact was immediate. US industries, especially electronics, construction, and automotive companies, woke up to find their primary copper source cut off. It triggered a supply crisis some compared to wartime shortages, both in speed and severity. Copper, long considered a quiet workhorse of the modern economy, was now at the heart of a major international trade dispute. American manufacturers scrambled to find alternative sources, often at exorbitant costs. The price of raw copper in the US, already pushed higher by the new tariff, was now poised to rise even further as supplies tightened. And this time, American businesses and consumers were right in the middle of it all. This situation raised a serious question. What happens when a country's own trade policy starts to undermine its manufacturing foundation? Canada wasn't just reacting out of anger, it was making a calculated move. Instead of stockpiling copper with nowhere to send it, Canadian producers quickly began looking for new buyers overseas. Practically overnight, shipments that would have gone to the US were redirected toward Asia and Europe. Mines in British Columbia and Ontario, which had long sent their copper to American factories, suddenly began routing their output to ports in Japan, South Korea, and even China. Canadian trade officials jumped into action, negotiating new deals abroad, and Asian smelters were eager to accept the metal the US had just priced itself out of. In effect, Canada started phasing the United States out of its copper export strategy. The Canadian government doubled down by announcing a nearly $1.8 billion Canadian dollar investment plan to boost export infrastructure. That included new shipping terminals, rail network expansions, and refinery upgrades, all designed to open up more global markets and reduce dependence on the US. This wasn't just a temporary fix, it was a long-term strategy. Canada was repositioning itself, not just as a resource provider, but as a global copper powerhouse no longer tied to unpredictable US trade decisions. The first major counterpunch in this trade dispute didn't come from Washington. It came from Ottawa. While President Trump's tariff hit like a blunt force, Canada's response was more like a strategic martial arts move, turning the force of America's policy back on itself. By rerouting its copper exports, Canada weakened its own vulnerability, while exposing a key flaw in the American plan. Analysts now predict that Canada's copper exports to the US could drop significantly within a year, assuming the country continues successfully diversifying its customer base. The ripple effects are already being felt. The US, which long took Canadian resources for granted, now faces growing isolation in the copper trade. American manufacturers, especially copper fabricators and wire producers, are suddenly staring down supply shortages and higher prices. A tightly connected North American supply chain is unraveling. And as Canada moves toward a more diversified and resilient position, it's no longer just a helpful neighbor. It's becoming a serious competitor on the global metal stage. The copper tariff didn't just provoke retaliation from Canada. It triggered disruption across US industries. Take the auto industry, for example, especially the fast-growing electric vehicle, EV sector. An average EV contains around 80 kilograms of copper, used in batteries, wiring, and electric motors. When the price of copper shot up due to the tariff, experts estimated it would add about $90 to the manufacturing cost of each new EV. That may not sound like a lot per car, but across hundreds of thousands of vehicles, it adds up quickly. For automakers like Tesla and Ford, this means millions of dollars in extra costs every month. Industry analysts warned that this could slow down the launch of new EV models or force companies to raise prices, potentially cooling consumer demand. Sure enough, reports began surfacing of US EV projects being delayed or reevaluated as companies struggled to source enough copper affordably. Ironically, a policy designed to strengthen American manufacturing was now threatening to derail one of its most innovative industries. Margins in the automotive sector are already slim, especially for EVs still ramping up production. And those margins just got even tighter. In America's manufacturing heartland, places like Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, smaller companies were also feeling the pain. These firms produce vital components like wires, circuit boards, and electric motors. For years, they had depended on steady, affordable copper imports from countries like Canada and Chile. Now, those imports were suddenly 18% or more expensive. Many of these businesses operate under fixed-price contracts, supplying parts to larger manufacturers or infrastructure projects. With copper prices soaring, their profit margins vanished overnight. Some companies had to back out of deals or lost bids entirely, especially to overseas competitors in places like Vietnam and Thailand, where copper was still priced at global market levels. In effect, the tariff built a financial wall around the United States, and any domestic business unable to climb over it quickly enough risked being priced out of the game. Stories began emerging of US suppliers losing orders for high-end cables or precision components, not because of quality, but because overseas vendors weren't burdened with the extra 50% cost. Foreign companies started swooping in to capture business that once reliably went to American factories. This was a textbook example of unintended consequences. A policy meant to support US industry was inadvertently pushing it toward isolation. Some economic commentators pointed out the historical parallels, recalling past eras when protectionist policies sparked global retaliation and trade breakdowns. The infamous Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s came to mind. We're not at that level yet, but there's growing concern that this could be the opening shot in a much wider trade conflict, one not limited to the US and Canada, but involving multiple global trading partners. What began as a debate over one industrial metal has turned into something far more personal for businesses and everyday consumers alike. Copper's price surge isn't some abstract economic figure. It shows up in the cost of your new car, your smartphone, or your home renovation. Consumers may not see a copper tariff line item on their receipts, but it's built into the prices they pay. Sometimes it's obvious, like a jump in your electric bill after utility companies raise rates to cover infrastructure costs. Other times, it's subtle, a small bump in appliance or electronics prices as manufacturers quietly pass along the increased costs. Either way, the effects are real, and they're hitting home. If you look ahead, there's a clear risk that inflation could spread from this one commodity, copper, into the broader economy. That kind of pressure could force the Federal Reserve to respond with tighter monetary policy, which would only add new challenges for economic growth. Still, not everyone sees the tariff as a mistake. Some view it as a necessary jolt to the system, an uncomfortable but essential move to push the US to finally rebuild its domestic mining and metal processing industries. In their view, America has for too long depended on foreign sources for key raw materials, and without bold action like this, that wouldn't change. From that perspective, the copper tariff is a painful but ultimately constructive step, one that could redirect capital, talent, and innovation back into America's resource sector. Whether that optimistic scenario plays out remains to be seen. What we do know is that the immediate costs are very real, while the potential benefits are uncertain and likely years away. That imbalance makes the tariff a politically difficult sell, especially if voters start linking it directly to rising prices in their everyday lives. Globally, the US decision to impose a sweeping tariff on copper from a close ally like Canada has raised serious concerns. If even Canada, one of the country's most trusted and integrated economic partners, isn't immune to sudden trade restrictions, it sends a message. No nation's trade relationship with the US is guaranteed. This realization is prompting many countries to reconsider their dependence on American markets. Canada is already leading the way in diversifying its exports. Others may soon follow. It's a kind of reverse globalization, a push away from reliance on the US triggered by growing uncertainty. Copper-producing nations like Chile and Peru responded diplomatically, formally asking the US to exempt their exports, They emphasize that their trade poses no threat to American security. But behind the scenes, they too are likely re-evaluating how much they want to rely on the US as a customer. Meanwhile, major copper importers like China may come out ahead. With exporters eager to shift away from the American market, China could negotiate better deals, expanding its influence in the global copper trade. All of this leads to a sobering question. Is this the outcome the US had in mind? The Trump administration set out to make the country stronger by protecting a vital industry. But the way the policy was implemented has instead revealed just how vulnerable parts of the US economy still are. At this point, American manufacturers are dealing with serious supply chain disruptions. Key allies are rethinking their trade ties, and everyday consumers are paying more for a wide range of products, all while domestic copper production remains largely unchanged. That's not to say things can't change. Policies can be reworked. Future trade negotiations might carve out exemptions or relief, and a new administration could reverse or soften the tariff if it proves too damaging. Over time, markets will adapt. Higher prices might eventually reduce demand, drive innovation, or encourage new sources of copper supply. But those shifts don't happen overnight. This $4.2 billion shock may go down as a turning point, one that put a spotlight on just how critical materials like copper are to the modern economy. Maybe it will inspire a smarter, national strategy around critical minerals, one that emphasizes resilience and sustainability in supply chains. Or maybe it will be remembered as a cautionary tale, an example of how sudden protectionist policies can backfire in a deeply interconnected world. One thing is certain: the copper tariff has opened a new chapter in US economic policy. The old assumption that American industries would always have easy, affordable access to global resources is quickly fading. The country must now come to terms with the reality that going it alone has limits, and Americans are already feeling the consequences. In factories that are running slower due to supply shortages, in infrastructure projects facing unexpected cost overruns, in households where budgets are tightening as prices creep up. A policy that promised greater self-sufficiency has, at least in the short term, exposed just how tightly the US was tied to global trade all along. The next few months will show whether this bold move will strengthen American industry in the long run, or if it will mark the moment the US accidentally sidelined itself from the global economic stage. Whichever way it goes, the impact will go far beyond copper. It will help shape America's future role in the world economy. Please subscribe to the Timefold channel and don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps us grow.